Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know some of you may still be coming in, but we're going to get started. I'm Laura Walker, president of Bennington College, and it is my great pleasure to be with you tonight to introduce this year's Robert H. Woodworth Science Lecture featuring Dr. Kara Lavender Law, and we are delighted that she is here with us. This series was established in 1988, so this has been going on quite a while, and it honors a longtime and beloved Bennington biology faculty member who was a pioneer in the development of time-lapse photography. Pretty cool. Robert Woodworth had a truly innovative approach to teaching, and his contributions to the college and the world are just too long for just one Zoom. Prior to this, at Bennington, he earned his Ph.D. at Harvard and was curator of the Harvard Botanical Gardens. He then taught here for 54 years, from 1935 until 1989, 54 years with Bennington College. He made his mark here early and often. In 1938, just after he arrived, he turned a boat into a botany classroom, and that is really kind of fitting because we're going to hear about boats and botany and science today. And in 1942, he launched a student and faculty-run farm on campus. You know, 5 alumni who worked with Robert in these early years are the ones who spearheaded this lecture series because they credited his limitless drive, energy, and imagination to make science and ideas as wide and inclusive as possible. In this spirit, we are so happy that these lectures are open to the public, and I know there are many, many of you from the public joining us tonight. Welcome to all of you, and welcome to the Bennington community. For those of you who don't know much about Bennington, we are a place of radical transformation. We were founded 90 years ago, and right at the beginning of the Depression, at 1932 or so, we empower our students to direct their own education through experiential learning, and we empower them and to build enduring relationships, to embrace the ethical, social, aesthetic, scientific, and poetic imaginations. Robert Woodworth served actually not just as a faculty member, but as an interim president in 1976. And he helped lead the construction of the Dickinson Science Building on campus and also the Visual and Performing Arts Center, VAPA. So in very Bennington style, it was about science and it was about the arts. And if he were here today, we would have been sure to leverage his expertise with our recent new wing of the barn. Bennington, Vermont was a special place for Robert and his family. He tended a vegetable garden, he raised chickens, and all 3 of his sons, like him, settled in the Green Mountain State. And we are privileged to be joined tonight by members of the Woodworth family. Thank you so much. There are tales from folks who remember Robert Woodworth building his house, which looked out at Mount Anthony by himself without the guidance of an architect. And the house turned out to be simply amazing. That to me is a wonderful metaphor for what our students experience here with their individualized plan process. They build their own house. With the Robert H. Woodworth Lecture Series, we have the distinct privilege to carry on and honor a legacy of scientific discovery here at Bennington. And now I am pleased to hand it over to Beyond Plastics Policy Director, Dr. Megan Wolfe, to tell us more about this year's distinguished speaker. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Laura Walker. Welcome. My name is Megan Wolfe. I'm the policy director at Beyond Plastics, which is a project out of Bennington College whose goal is to end plastic pollution. That's a pretty tall order, but it's not an impossible one or even an illogical one. We may feel like we're drowning in plastic, and in fact, we may be drowning in it, but plastic is, historically speaking, a brand new problem. Half of all the plastic in existence today was created in the past 15 to 20 years, which, to put a fine point on it, it's a problem that's barely older than my cat. Now, we don't need to think hard to imagine ways out of an intractable problem here. We just need to think back to where we each were in 2005 or so. It's going to be a matter of political will to reach the simplest and most effective solution of all right now, which is turning off the tap on the production of single-use plastics that we don't need. But that's me with my policy hat on. So let me replace it for a minute with my researcher hat on and introduce you to Dr. Kara Lavender Law. Dr. Law is a research professor of oceanography at Sea Education Association. She holds several scientific advisory roles and strives to efficiently communicate scientific understanding of ocean plastics, including major knowledge gaps, to wide-ranging audiences, including policymakers, industry groups, students, and the general public. Since I started working in plastics, Kara Law has become the go-to source for accurate and up-to-date information, particularly where these so-called knowledge gaps are concerned. Now, leveling with you, a knowledge gap is what scientists euphemistically call a really gaping mystery that makes further work difficult. For instance, we know that more than 8.3 billion tons of plastic have been created and that 90% of that is still in existence, but we don't really know where a lot of it is or what it's doing in the ecosystem. Dr. Law has been an excellent source of ideas and research in this domain, and we're indebted to her. We need the path to solutions to be informed by the best available science. Here's why I think she's so dedicated and uniquely good at her research. Dr. Law's original training was in ocean physics, studying the action of winds on the surface of the ocean, the turning of the earth, and other factors that create ocean gyres. If you follow those currents and the actions of the gyres, you can come to understand where things are in the ocean. Observers first started noticing plastics in the ocean as early as the 1970s, but they didn't make too much of it. These were small bits of plastic floating in the North Atlantic and the North Pacific. Dr. Law is a scholar, but she's also a sailor. She learned to sail in graduate school in the late 1990s on small boats and joined Sea in 2003, teaching in the semester undergraduate program. Their boats and their program are both fairly iconic. They sail those tall ships that look so beautiful in the harbor. Now, Dr. Law started paying attention to plastics in the mid-2000s when a journalist asked whether the sea crew would be sailing into the mid-Pacific garbage patch. Most of us have heard of that now, but when Dr. Law Googled it then, it was an unfolding phenomenon. It was a new term, new observation, not a lot known, except that it turns out that some things were known, and by Sea itself. As Dr. Law will tell you, the undergraduates on Sea's vessels had been using a fine net called a plankton trawl to monitor what's in the water for the past 50 years. The organization had anecdotal accounts of plastics in those nets from the late 1970s and data as early as the mid-1980s. So to make a long story short, by 2009, Dr. Law had transitioned from full-time teaching and sailing to researching plastics, which has been very good for the state of the field. She's now exploring knowledge gaps, large and small, and passing on her findings in really important ways. She served as co-principal investigator of the Marine Debris Working Group at the National Center for Ecological Analysis and Synthesis. She's a co-chair of the SCORE working group called FLOTSAM, Floating Litter and its Oceanic Transport Analysis and Modeling, and has participated in many international working groups, workshops, and panels, including at the US National Academies on the topic of ocean plastics. In 2018, she served as a witness in the US Senate Committee on Environment and Public Works hearing on cleaning up the oceans, how to reduce the impact of man-made trash on the environment, wildlife, and human health. Dr. Law received her Ph.D. from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography in the University of California, San Diego in physical oceanography, and she got her BS in mathematics from Duke University. She joins us this evening from Portland, Maine, and please join me in welcoming Kara Lavender Law.
Thank you so much, Megan, and thank you so much, President Walker. That was the best introduction I've ever heard and also served as a really nice trailer for the talk. So thank you so much, Megan. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just give me a second here to get oriented. Okay, and I'm assuming everybody can see or somebody will let me know. All right, well, I thank you all so much. Good evening, well, at least good evening from the East Coast. And thanks especially to those of you who may be in New England choosing to listen to this talk instead of experiencing finally a little bit of spring weather. It's really a pleasure to be here tonight and an honor to give the Woodworth Science Lecture. And I'd like to thank President Walker for the invitation and also for the really nice background on Professor and Interim President Woodworth. And I also would like to thank Judith Enck and Megan Wolfe from Beyond Plastics for their role in bringing me here to speak with you today. So tonight I'll share my perspective on plastics and plastic pollution through the ocean lens. And of course, the global plastics problem is much more than just an ocean problem. But as I will argue, without this ocean focus, I think that we might not yet be taking seriously the complex situation that we've created with plastics. More than 70 years of innovation in this exceptional class of materials has brought really unprecedented societal advancement, and with it, a reliance on plastics. We simply cannot live without plastics in the year 2022. However, as we all know, this has come at a cost, and that's a cost that we are only now beginning seriously to address. So the story I'll tell tonight will focus on the environmental cost at what I like to call the end of the pipe. And by that, I mean from the middle of the open ocean. But first, we're going to start with a little bit of a time perspective. So what I'm showing you here on the left is a curve in blue showing the growth of global plastics production in units of million metric tons as a function of time since what we commonly think of as the nominal start of the commercial production of plastics in 1950. So as you can see from the curve, nearly from the start, plastics production experienced rapid growth. And in fact, over this time period, the growth in plastics production has outpaced that of all other bulk materials, including steel, aluminum, and cement. And as Megan mentioned, global production has more than doubled since the year 2000. Well, this growth reflects the nature of this class of materials that are now essential to modern society. The properties of synthetic polymers, including their lightweight, their durability, strength, and chemical resistance, combined with a breadth of chemical additives, allow seemingly limitless versatility for both short-term, such as single use, and long-term or durable applications. Well, in work led by Roland Geyer at the University of California, Santa Barbara, as part of that NC's working group that Megan mentioned, we built this production curve and then integrated it and found that over this time period, more than 8.3 billion metric tons of plastics have been produced. Also on this figure, you see this red curve on the same scale and over the same time period. And this shows plastic waste generation. What we found in this work was that 70% of plastics produced since 1950 have become waste, yet only 9% of that plastic waste has been recycled and only 12% has been incinerated. So this leaves the vast majority of that waste residing in landfills or in the natural environment. And together with the plastics that are still in use, this means that we estimated about 90% are still in existence on the planet today. Well, we often hear the term plastic used as if it were a single material, where instead plastics, as I mentioned, are a material class consisting of hundreds or maybe even thousands of distinct polymers that are further diversified by chemical additives. But I want to break down that curve of global plastic production a little bit. And here what you're seeing is a similar curve to the last slide, where the green line is actually identical to that production curve I showed you a moment ago. But also on here, what you see is a line just below it, indicating the plastics that are created with a carbon-carbon backbone. So I've put the chemical structure here for any chemists in the audience. But what we find is that the majority, nearly 77% of plastics produced to date, have this common chemical structure, this carbon-carbon backbone. Well, why is this important? This is important because the chemical structure defines the properties of plastics I mentioned earlier, but it also renders these materials strongly resistant to biodegradation. So I've shown here on the right some examples of the types of products that you find both with short-term use and long-term use that are made of these carbon-carbon backbone plastics: polyethylene, polystyrene, polypropylene, PVC. So these materials are strongly resistant to biodegradation. And from a material and a product perspective, for many of these products, this is important and typically desirable. We want some of these products to be used for years or for decades, and others, perhaps containing food, should probably not be biodegrading. However, the resistance to biodegradation also leads to persistence if plastics are lost to the natural environment. So if these materials are lost to the environment, they are persistent, but they're not stable in their composition. What we know is that when they are exposed to sunlight, photochemical degradation occurs. And what that means is it causes the material to become weaker, to lose strength, and it becomes susceptible to breakage, ultimately causing fragmentation into smaller particles. I'll come back to this point a bit later. The last point I want to make with this particular slide is that packaging, which is the blue curve shown here, accounts for nearly 45% of global plastics demand by application. And the majority of that packaging is composed of materials made from these carbon-carbon backbone polymers. We all know that packaging readily becomes waste, and this explains in part the equivalently rapid rise in the global plastic waste generation that I showed you in the previous slide. Really, it's the same shape as the plastics production curve, just slightly offset because some of those products are used for a longer period of time. Okay, we're now going to use the same timeline to look at the historical evolution of our knowledge of plastics in the ocean. So same plot as I showed you a second ago. The first evidence of plastics contamination in the ocean actually was in 1966, when already 74% of lace and albatross chick carcasses found in the Northwest Hawaiian Islands were found to contain plastics in their guts. And this was when global plastic production was just 5% of current production levels. The first reports of microplastics floating in the North Atlantic and in the North Pacific Oceans was in the early 1970s. Also in this time period, larger recognizable debris items were documented in the North Pacific by oceanographers out doing research. And this was when plastics production was just 10% of current production levels. In the mid-1980s, my organization, Sea Education Association, or SEA, we first started researching floating microplastics, and I'll tell you a bit more about that story later. But I would argue that not until 2003 did people really start to pay attention. And this is when Charles Moore, an avid sailor and environmentalist, wrote an article in Natural History magazine describing his view of the North Pacific Ocean from the deck of his sailing ship as, quote, as far as the eye could see, the site of plastic. And it was in this article that the term garbage patch was born. So although plastics production had always been on this growth trajectory and scientists had been documenting contamination in the oceans by plastic for decades, really no one was talking very much about plastic in the ocean until the garbage patch entered public consciousness. Well, soon after its birth, the garbage patch developed into a phenomenon. It was described as twice the size of Texas, 3 times the size of France, having more plastic than plankton, and being a floating island visible from space. Although striking and immensely memorable in its portrayal, there is no floating island of trash visible from space. Well, here's the data to support this. This is the actual view of the garbage patch taken from space. This is a photograph taken by a friend of mine, Megan MacArthur, who has a Ph.D. in oceanography as well, and is also a NASA astronaut. And she launched to the International Space Station last year, and I put in a request for a picture of the garbage patch from space, and she and her colleagues on the International Space Station kindly complied. So what you can see in this photo is that really you can only see from space blue ocean, and more frequently than not, clouds. Well, let's come back down to Earth and look at what the garbage patch looks like from the deck of a ship, which is a view that I'm more familiar with. Well, when sailing in the subtropical latitudes of the North Atlantic or the North Pacific, like our students and our crew do on our sailing ships, when you're sailing in these regions, the so-called garbage patches, this is what you'll typically see on a nice calm day. You see water as far as the eye can see, the horizon, there's typically light winds, and not a whole lot visible other than water, sky, and clouds. There are very few ships, although you might be lucky enough to spot dolphins, albatross, or flying fish, which is always exciting. But you will see floating debris items drifting by, and these can float by perhaps as frequently as 1 item per minute. But they're typically singular items. They're sometimes identifiable, like this boot, which is floating upside down, or this tire, or this 5-gallon bucket. But more often than not, they are fragments or chunks of things whose history you really don't know. So this is some kind of plastic film. You see in this bucket a whole collection of items, many of which are these kind of fragments that I've just been describing. These were actually collected in the North Pacific, in the Eastern North Pacific in 2012, about 1.5 years after the massive Japanese earthquake and tsunami delivered millions of tons of debris to the other side of the Pacific Ocean. So it was very interesting to sail out there and see some of these very recognizable items from that event. Well, to an open ocean sailor, seeing these kinds of items floating hundreds or thousands of kilometers from land is at first really surprising. And it's even a bit thrilling. Like, what is that tea kettle or that children's toy or the tire doing out there? But then it's shocking and it's ultimately distressing because nobody wants to see trash floating in the middle of the ocean. But the picture changes quite a lot when you measure what's floating at the sea surface by towing a plankton net like this one through the water at the sea surface for about 30 minutes and by sifting through its contents. And this is what thousands of our undergraduate students in our sea semester program have done twice a day, every day for decades aboard our sailing research vessels. So just a brief description, if you're not familiar with Sea Education Association or SEA, we are a nonprofit educational organization located in Woods Hole, Massachusetts on Cape Cod. And this year we're celebrating our 50th anniversary as an institution and offering the Sea Semester program to undergraduate students from universities around the country and increasingly abroad. The students go out to sea on our tall sailing ships to conduct oceanographic research on ships like this one. And that's after taking coursework on our Woods Hole campus for several weeks. So they prepare by taking courses and preparing research proposals on shore and then join the ships and serve as full crew members, navigating, raising and lowering sails, working in the galley, full-fledged crew members also collecting data and samples to support their collective and independent oceanographic research projects. So one of the main workhorses pieces of gear to support those student research projects are Newstone nets like this one, which we use to sample the sea surface for plankton and macroalgae, tar balls, and plastic debris. So if you tow this net for 30 minutes in the subtropics and then bring it aboard and dump its contents into a sieve, you see something like this. Among the plankton are small bits of plastic that we now term, sort of around the world, microplastics. This is a particularly dense sample of plastics, but I show it for illustrative purposes. What you can see is that most of these particles are readily distinguishable from organic matter, which really shows up sort of as brown or clear goo. These are distinguishable by their bright colors and their irregular shapes. They have a typically hard texture if you pick them up with a set of tweezers. And it turns out from laboratory work we've done back on shore that the human eye and the human brain does a really good job identifying plastics from organic matter at the size collected in our plankton nets, which is about 1/3 of a millimeter mesh. Well, what are microplastics? What is the technical scientific definition of a microplastic? After all this research, that definition, I think, is still a small bit of plastic. There's not an exact definition yet, although I think we are trying to work as a community towards one. But why not? Why is there no specific definition? Well, the earliest definition of microplastics really reflected the method of observation, and that was those plankton nets that were, again, historically used to measure other things. So particles larger than the mesh size of the plankton nets, typically about 1/3 of a millimeter, and particles smaller than 5 millimeters were sort of the original size definition of microplastics. But as time has gone on, we've used finer filter mesh. And as a consequence, we can collect smaller and smaller particles. And what we're finding is that these microplastics exist potentially all the way down to nanoscales. So microplastics are typically still defined by their size, although if you're reading the scientific literature, those definitions can vary widely. Microplastics are also commonly described by their shape. So there's some common shape categories. One is pellet. So here's an example of 2 different pellets. And by pellet, we mean basically the raw material of plastics. This is the form that plastic resin takes most frequently to be sent to a converter who will then mold it into products and add additives for whatever that product requires. The other shapes include fragment, which is sort of anything that's not a pellet or anything that is not a line. You see lots of long, thin strands here. At the scale that we're looking at from our plankton nets, these are not fibers from clothing. These are probably byproducts of fishing nets or fishing line. We also have films. Let's see, there's very thin, sort of clear translucent films in this image, and foam is the other. So you see bits of polystyrene foam. So shape is used really frequently because we try to get at the source of these microplastics, and sometimes we can get clues by the shape. So some microplastics are actually manufactured in this size. The plastics are intended to be this small. Those are things like those industrial resin pellets. but also cosmetic microbeads, those beads that you find in things like toothpaste and wash-off cosmetics. But most of what you see in the image here and in the previous are particles that were made this small because they were once larger objects that then fragmented. So the origin of the particles can't be determined by looking at them or by examining them chemically. We can't tell where they came from geographically. Most often than not, we can't tell the type of object, even if we measure the type of polymer that they're made of. I'll come back to that one in a second. There are also other types of microplastics I haven't really mentioned, which are those that are shed during use. So that includes things like fibers from textiles, clothing, things like paint flakes that come off of objects or ships, and tire wear particles. And those are not shown in that image. Okay, so as I was starting to get at, microplastics are made of a wide variety of different polymers. Shown here are the codes that you may be familiar with from the bottom of your plastic products in your home. These are the most commonly highly produced plastics. But what's really important is that even polymer type can't tell you a whole lot about the object, because the chemistry of the plastic is not just determined by the polymer, it's also determined by the chemical additives. And this is why a number 2 HDPE milk jug is different from a number 2 detergent bottle, for example. So the additives are proprietary formulations that give products their color or enhanced properties like flexibility or protection from UV light or antimicrobial properties. So to summarize, microplastics are a really diverse and a complex category of contaminants. And this is in contrast to, your sort of typical chemical contaminant that's a single molecule, for example. And this is made even more complex because their characteristics evolved when they're exposed in the environment. So they become smaller, they change shape, and their chemistry can change. Well, in the 15 years that I've been working on ocean plastics, it has become readily apparent from the science that we've done and many others have done that microplastics are the most numerically abundant and also the most widespread type of plastic debris found in the marine environment. So of course there is large debris, and we'll talk a little bit about that in a minute. Microplastics have been found on beaches. This is a photo from Camilo Beach in Hawaii, where the plastics are mixed right in with the volcanic beach sand. We know that they're floating on the water column, as I've described. This is another SEA sample. Then they have also been found much deeper in the water column, especially those microfibers. Microplastics have been found in deep sea sediments. This is an early example from the North and South Atlantic and the Mediterranean Sea. So these particles were buried in those sediments. And they've even been found frozen into Arctic sea ice. And in this case, you're now seeing some of those textile fibers. These are small enough to be considered to be textile fibers. But we've also learned that microplastics are not only in the marine environment, they've also now been found in freshwater environments like lakes and streams and rivers. They've been found in the terrestrial environment, including agricultural soils as well as other soils. Microplastics are in the air, they're in snow, they're in rain falling on national parks, they're in drinking water, bottled water, wastewater, storm water. It seems that the smaller the particle, the more abundant and widespread they are, especially those microfibers. And that's probably because not only can they be readily transported in water, but they can be also transported in the air. So this is some really nice work by Janice Brani at Utah State University over the past last year. So first she examined wet and dry deposition in US national parks. So particles falling out of the air when it was raining or snowing and just in dry weather. And what she found was that 2 to 6% of those particulate aerosols, those particles dispersed in the air, consisted of plastics. She then published a follow-up modeling study to assess the likely sources of the atmospheric microplastics that were deposited in the Western US and globally. And really what I want you to notice here is this global map of modeled, again from a computer model, microplastic deposition, where the reds are high and the blues are low. And the main point here is to show that that deposition is not equal everywhere. Well, this is a similar result to what we found by sailing and sampling the ocean surface over the past decades at SEA. So what I'm showing you here are 2 maps from SEA's long-term data sets collected with the plankton net that I showed you earlier. So on the left, you're seeing a map of the Western North Atlantic Ocean. Here's North America, South America, here's the Caribbean Sea. On this map, each dot indicates a single plankton net tow, and it's colored according to the measured concentration of microplastics that came up in that net in units of pieces per square kilometer. So the darkest blue circles indicate zero plastics, and the black stars are the highest concentrations of about 200,000 pieces per square kilometer. And then the map is similar on the right-hand side, except we're showing the Eastern Pacific Ocean. Here's North America, here's Hawaii, Tahiti, and Puerto Vallarta, Mexico. So here on the right, we're actually seeing a much broader distribution in latitude from about 55 degrees north down into the Southern Hemisphere, whereas in the Atlantic, we're just looking in the Northern Hemisphere. So if you look at the color shading here, what you see is that the highest concentrations, the reds and oranges and yellows and all of those stars really occur in a very distinct band of latitude between about 20 and 40 degrees north latitude. And this is what the real garbage patch is. So this is the accumulation zone of floating microplastics. So surprisingly, the highest concentrations that we've measured in our nets are not close to land, where presumably a lot of this plastic is entering, but they are found far offshore. And in fact, the highest concentration we've measured was quite literally in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean. And in the Pacific, you see the same pattern. You see between 20 and 40 degrees north, the highest concentrations. Again, this is now the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, really described by these small particles floating at the sea surface. And those are there because of ocean currents, which I'm not going to talk about very much tonight, but would love to talk about more. Now, I do want to mention that, we do have these concentration zones, but there's very large variation even within these garbage patches. If you look between sequential tows, which were only taken a few hours apart, for example, over here, you can see very, very high concentration, a very low concentration. And we do get plenty of tows in the garbage patches where you see zero plastic. The Pacific map is a little nicer because you can really see this accumulation zone in the subtropical gyre highlighted, whereas in the equator and in the tropics, we see very low concentrations. So the point here is that for particles of this size, ocean currents in these basin scale ocean gyres driven by ocean currents largely determine the accumulation pattern. Now I'm showing here another map of the distribution of microplastics from a different initiative, from the Citizen Scientist Initiative led by adventure scientists. And in this program, volunteers across the globe collected 1 liter water samples from both marine and freshwater systems. And then those were filtered on a very, very fine filter for particles larger than 0.45 microns. So the smallest particle that could theoretically be measured by this method is about 750 times smaller than the smallest particles collected in our plankton net tows, like I showed you a second ago. So the map is constructed in a somewhat similar way, where the dots that are orange show you samples containing plastic, and the bigger the dot, the more plastic, whereas the yellow had no plastic. And what I really want you to notice here is that the pattern is quite different. When we're looking at these smaller particles, there is not as obvious or a distribution pattern. Yes, some of the highest concentrations are found sort of in the open ocean, but in here we're seeing really high values in the tropics. And those concentrations are highly variable around the globe, from 1 or 2 microplastics per liter to more than 500. So comparing the two slides together, the previous slide and this one, there are 2 things I want you to remember. One, a microplastic is not a microplastic is not a microplastic. How we measure these things matters because there is a huge variation in particle size. And secondly, the microplastics are not, while they are globally distributed, they're not everywhere in the same amounts. Okay, well, naturally faced with this widespread global contamination, environmental scientists want to understand the impacts on biota and ecosystems by microplastics. And this continues to be a major focus of the research field. So especially if we focus on microplastics in the marine environment, the primary concern is associated with wildlife eating them. So we know that large marine animals can ingest whole items like flower pots and car parts in whales, or plastic bags in turtles, bottle caps and cigarette lighters in seabirds. But microplastics are small enough to be ingested by much smaller organisms, as small as plankton at the base of the food web, or barnacles, and then of course by fish and other larger animals. Plastics ingestion has now been reported for more than 700 species of marine organisms. And we know that ingested plastics can cause internal injury if they're large enough. We know that they reduce stomach volume and can cause animals to feel falsely full, falsely satiated. They can also cause inflammation or other sublethal effects. Now, while plastic ingestion alone may pose risks to individual marine animals, that risk may be elevated due to the chemicals that are added during manufacture, or that are sorbed to the plastics from seawater. We know that these chemicals can cause harm to organisms. We know that just by the nature of the chemicals themselves. But what's challenging, and well, the concern is that the sorbed chemicals then, or those present for manufacture, can transfer into animal tissue after the plastics are eaten. And this has been shown to occur in the lab for a variety of combinations of specific animals with specific plastics and specific chemicals. But does that mean it's occurring in nature? Well, this is a fairly complicated slide that I'm going to try to talk you through at a high level. It's not hard, it's just busy. So this is a figure from a 2019 critical review and meta-analysis by Chelsea Rockman's group at University of Toronto. And really the goal of this study was to evaluate the evidence published in the scientific literature on the impacts of plastic debris ranging in size from nanometers up to kilometers in marine, freshwater, and terrestrial ecosystems. So now we're looking well beyond the ocean. So each of these plots is showing you on the left and on the right size of debris from nanometers all the way up to kilometers, and looking at the level of biological organization. So they were looking for studies that were trying to evaluate whether or not there was an effect on ecosystems, assemblages down to individual organisms, and then suborganism effects like effects on organs or cells or macromolecules or even smaller. So the red line I'm showing you here is showing you a sort of rough approximation of where you would call microplastics to the left of the line and macro or large plastic debris to the right of the line. And I want you to focus on the left side. The two boxes are showing you now, shaded boxes are showing you studies that tested a specific effect of a particular size debris at a specific level of biological organization, and whether they found that effect. And the darker the box, the more evidence for that for effects at that level. On the right-hand side, you see that they tested for an effect, but didn't find it. So when we look at just the microplastics, there were 421 different effects tested in mainly laboratory studies using microplastics and specific animals. And the results were that in 47% of those studies, the effect was tested and detected. And typically, of course, these are ill effects. On the right side, you see 53% of studies tested an effect, but was unable to detect it. So really what this says is that we can't yet, or perhaps ever, make sweeping generalizations about the risk or harm to animals or ecosystems. There's reason for concern. We do see evidence of biological impacts. But because about half of the studies didn't find an impact, that tells you how complex it is, because we're dealing with variation in different types of animals, different types of exposures. And moving from the lab to the ocean, of course, you have to simplify in the lab, but in the environment, exposures are likely to be complex mixtures of materials and their concentrations are highly variable. So in most places, what particular animals are even exposed to is even largely unknown. So this is a really difficult challenge. So I do want to point you now just away from microplastics to look to the right side of these red lines. So in studies looking at large plastic debris, they're mainly focused on tissues up to ecosystems. There is very clear evidence of impact, right? There are very few studies who found no impact of large debris on animals in all of those ecosystems. So there's much stronger evidence of harm. And this shouldn't be surprising because we've seen these impacts over and over again in images such as these that evoke really visceral reactions to ocean plastics. So earlier I suggested that without an ocean focus, we might not yet be here discussing a global. All right, did everybody see the turtle before it went dead?
I didn't get the turtle.
No, didn't get the turtle.
All right, that's where we'll start then.
Okay,
Thank you
apologies
so
to all
much.
and sundry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I don't know if that was my end or anyway.
No, I don't think it was.
Just the internet. Okay, so here we have the other iconic photo that many people have probably seen. This is this olive ridley sea turtle who had a really nasty encounter with a plastic drinking straw. So I'm basically trying to make the point that it's really hard to ignore visions of garbage patches and these charismatic animals that have clearly suffered because of plastic. But wait, there's more. Beyond the risks and impacts to marine wildlife are now potential impacts to humans, specifically for microplastics. And we've now seen a wealth of studies that document microplastics in the items that we consume, like these things that you see on this image here. Tea, honey, beer, drinking water, tap water. Well, it's one thing to find the microplastics contaminating our food and drink, but are they actually in our bodies? Recent medical studies indicate yes, in fact, there is exposure and transmission in the human body, starting with this study in 2019 of microplastics in human stool, and advancing with microplastics in human placentas, human living lung tissue, and most recently, plastic pollution in human blood. Are these plastics causing harm? We don't yet have the answer to this question, but I think you can expect to hear a lot more on this because toxicology research specific to humans is now ramping up. And I think because of this concern about human health, it's safe to say the topic of plastic pollution is not going away. So how do we begin addressing this problem? Very briefly, I want to talk about some of the sources of plastics to the environment. So one of the main sources we know of plastic to the environment is waste that we all generate leaking to the ocean from land. So also part of that NC's Marine Degree Working Group, a study led by Jana Jambeck in 2015, estimated for the first time the scale of this input of plastic waste from land into the ocean. And that midpoint estimate, there was an uncertainty range, was 8 million metric tons in the year 2010. How much is 8 million metric tons? This is the equivalent of dumping one New York City garbage truck full of plastic waste into the ocean every minute of every day for an entire year. So it's a big number. Well, why is this plastic leaking into the ocean from land? This could result from a variety of pathways. One could result in places from plastic waste in places that lack a formal waste management infrastructure. So this is a photo from a colleague in Vietnam where the river was the waste management system. You dump your trash in and it goes away. So by formal waste management infrastructure, I mean the infrastructure to collect waste and transport it to be processed in managed facilities. But this can also happen in places that have perfectly good waste management infrastructure because of intentional or accidental loss. So littering or illegal dumping, or maybe that candy wrapper blew out of your hand or the mask fell out of your pocket or you left that plastic toy on the beach. So this is a photo of the Los Angeles River after a major rainstorm. And you can see an actual trash boom. It's basically an oil boom capturing all of this floating waste before it went out to the ocean. Well, in 2020, we actually decided to take a deep dive into the US contribution of plastic waste to the environment. So this was a follow-on to the Jambeck study, but we wanted to get the best data we possibly could to understand what was happening in the US. So we started with waste generation, and we estimated from data from a variety of sources that the US generated 42 million metric tons of plastic waste in the year 2016. And in fact, that ranked us #1 in plastic waste generation globally. Well, in the US, we do have robust waste management infrastructure, although I'm sure everybody knows that the specific collection and treatment methods vary according to where you live locally. Nonetheless, illegal dumping still occurs and accidental and intentional littering still occurs. So we estimated how much waste was ending up in the environment within US borders due to the littering and illegal dumping, and that was up to 1 million metric tons. And this is litter that's on land, but could leak into freshwater and potentially the ocean. But the other question we asked is, well, what's actually happening to the plastics that are collected and processed in our waste management systems? So we looked at plastic waste that was collected for recycling in the year 2016. So plastics are often collected in many of our communities in single stream recycling programs where you put your plastic in with your glass, aluminum, and paper. And that collected material then has to be separated mechanically and manually and then compressed into bales to be transported to reprocessing facilities. If you live in a community with single stream recycling, you're probably aware of the problem of contamination by dirty items like half full peanut butter jars, but especially by items that aren't recyclable, like Christmas tree lights or garden hoses or, all kinds of stories of things that get tossed into the blue bin. Oftentimes, well-meaning people put an item in the blue bin in the spirit of wish cycling, really hoping that it'll have another life. Unfortunately, contamination increases the cost of sorting and it lowers the value of the bales that are sold to reprocessors. Well, in 2016, only 9.3% of US plastic waste was even collected for recycling. And here I'll call that plastic scrap. That number is decreasing over time. I've seen 2 reports now in the past couple of weeks about that percentage has gone down to about 5% in the past year or 2. Well, once those bales are collected, we found that the United States was exporting more than 50% of the plastics that we diligently put in our blue bin. So for years, and we still do export bales of plastics to countries around the world who want the material for reprocessing. So we used data from an international database on trade, and we estimated how much was exported, which was 51%. And then we also used data on waste management globally and found that 89% of that waste was exported to countries who had trouble managing their own waste. They had more than 20% inadequately managed waste. That just means that they didn't have the infrastructure to properly manage it. And in fact, most of the waste up until about 2016 was going to China and Hong Kong. Well, when we looked at the fate of that, we know that the waste was being shipped overseas, largely to Asia, and these are the people that receive that scrap and pick through it to find the plastics that have value. And we estimated that based on the contamination in those plastic bales and the materials that had value and the fact that they didn't really have infrastructure, we estimated that through that process of in reprocessing, about up to another 1 million metric ton of plastic scrap was being mismanaged after it was imported, contributing to that US plastic footprint of waste to the environment. So together, when you put the domestically lost waste and the mismanaged waste from importing countries, we found that US plastic waste inputs to the coastal environment were among the highest in the world. That's up to about 1.5 million metric tons. All right, there are of course other sources of plastic debris to the ocean. Very briefly, natural disasters like hurricanes and tsunamis can obviously put a tremendous amount of debris of all types, not just plastic, into the ocean in a short period of time. We know that microplastics that go down our drains can end up in the environment. So if you still have a remnant face wash with plastic microbeads, or if you wash your synthetic clothing, those particles can go into a wastewater treatment plant like the one here in my community, which may not capture all of those particles and then actually flows out in an underwater outfall into the ocean. This flows out about 1 mile away. We also know that plastics, especially microplastics, can go down drains, stormwater drains. Again, in a community near me, this stormwater goes right out to the ocean. And of particular concern with stormwater runoff are microplastics generated from all of our driving. So particles on our tires that shut off, or road paint, for example. We also know that plastics go into the ocean from activities conducted at sea, and a major source is definitely fishing gear, lost fishing gear or aquaculture gear. We know that container ships can lose their cargo, and even us oceanographers actually deliberately put plastic into the ocean to make measurements. I can tell you that from some work we've done, the oceanography number is quite small. The container ship number is actually smaller than you would guess, but the fishing and aquaculture number is probably really big, and we just don't have a handle on that yet. So in fact, today we don't really have robust estimates for the total amount of plastic entering the marine environment or the environment as a whole. Well, I want to get towards the end here with a little bit of a summary. What do we actually know? What have I been discussing thus far? We actually know that billions of metric tons of plastics exist on the planet, and that number will continue to grow, and it will likely accelerate by all predictions. We know that most plastics are strongly resistant to biodegradation, and therefore they persist in the environment. We know that plastic debris is widespread, but not uniform, across the globe, and it spans microns and possibly nanometers in size to greater than hundreds of meters in size. And we have clear evidence that plastic debris harms wildlife. But what are the things we sort of know, or open questions that we still have? First, we have rough estimates that on the order of tens of millions of tons of plastic debris enters ecosystems annually. Believe it or not, there's still a lot of work to do to narrow down that number. And in particular, environmental measurements of plastic input to air or water or soil are relatively sparse, and they're extremely variable. You need to do a lot of measurements to really nail down that number. We know that plastics are readily transported by air and water, and we also know they're transformed when they're exposed in the environment to sunlight and heat and oxygen. but we don't understand the mechanisms by which they break down into those smaller microplastics and potentially nanoplastics. And as a consequence, we don't understand the ultimate fate or have an idea of the lifetime of plastics in the environment. We know that contamination of wildlife by microplastics is widespread, but risk assessments, in other words, the actual sort of quantitative measure of harm, are underway, but they're really still in their infancy. So it's really difficult to quantify or even qualitatively determine the scale and the scope of impacts. That said, even with these knowledge gaps, we do know more than enough now from an environmental perspective to take action. So the title of this talk is A Global Look at Plastics. And tonight I'm really addressing only one aspect of this problem, which is the threat to environmental health, with a focus on the oceans. But there are many other aspects that we could consider with respect to plastics, including things like the impacts of plastics manufacture, use, and disposal on things like greenhouse gas emissions or energy use, environmental justice, and economics. But to wrap up, I do want to discuss approaches to addressing the global problem, really sticking to the environmental perspective. So if we frame the problem this way, I will propose that the proximate solution, by which I mean the closest or the most immediate solution to address the threat, is simply to prevent plastics from entering ecosystems, biota, or humans. And we see a lot of frameworks proposed to prevent plastics from leaking to the environment. The one I'm showing here was put forth by the US National Academies Committee I served on last year. And this is just presenting a framework of interventions beginning at the production phase of plastics and stepping through the pathway to design and use and disposal and potentially loss to the environment. So many actions have been proposed and have been taken almost at every single colorful stage shown on this slide. And those actions include, but they're definitely not limited to, things like government regulation that might limit production or ban specific items, innovation to improve the recyclability of particular products or materials, and innovation in recycling mechanisms and processes, innovation to reduce packaging through new product delivery systems. Other actions could include changes in consumer behavior. If we all buy less, use less, then we will make less waste, and we don't even put it into the system to begin with. We can improve waste management. We can create infrastructure where it's lacking around the world and within our country. We can incentivize collection of items. We can improve waste processing. And we can capture waste as close to the place and time that it leaked to the environment as possible. And in fact, we'll always have to clean up. It's just a fact. So how do we begin to prioritize all these actions? There are lots of different ways to think about it. One way might be to think about prioritizing specific materials or specific items that are likely to cause the greatest harm. We could prioritize specific items or uses that are really easy to eliminate, the sort of low-hanging fruit approach that was used to ban cosmetic microbeads here in the US. We can prioritize actions that can be accomplished immediately. We could put filters on our washing machines to prevent those clothing fibers from going into the wastewater treatment plant to begin with. We can put trash capture devices in rivers and harbors. And we can and should do all of these while simultaneously investing in the more difficult, the longer term, but ultimately the most sustainable solutions that ultimately lead towards a zero waste and circular economy. So to wrap up, I hope I've convinced you that from an environmental perspective, we know more than enough to take action now at global scales, all the way down to local scales, and really across all sectors. And here's just a couple more of those schematics of ways to approach the problem. Because really we're all stakeholders and we all play multiple roles in the global plastics problem. Finally, I just have to acknowledge that over the past 15 plus years that I've been working on this topic, it would not have been possible. I never would have even gotten interested without the work of more than 10,000 C semester students, as well as my right-hand woman, Jessica Donahue, and many collaborators at SEA over the years, as well as Chris Reddy from the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. And I've been really fortunate to form collaborations across many different disciplines, nearly from the start of my career studying ocean plastics, including in these working groups. And then finally, I have to thank the federal agencies and also the private foundations and other organizations that have supported the work over the past almost 2 decades. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Law. That was really fascinating. I'm watching questions pouring in on the chat and the Q&A. If you have a question, please do put it in the box. I am looking. We only have a few minutes because we had our technical difficulties. Also, I ran over long in the introduction, but it felt worth it. Still, we
And
do
I'm
want
happy to stay later. I have time. So if you want to go over, that's fine.
Okay, great. Well, let's see. Some of the more interesting questions, I mean, they're all interesting, but one person has asked a question that actually I find interesting myself and ponder. Is microplastic degrading at the same rate as macroplastic? I know that there are different kinds of forces at work based on the size of the article.
Yeah, so that's a really great question, and something that we're actively researching. So certainly, if you think about sunlight as a major driving factor in weakening the material, if you have a microplastic, it has a much greater surface area compared to volume. A small plastic has a greater surface area to volume ratio, meaning it gets more sunlight sort of per mass of the object than a large plastic. But the way that weakening happens, we think, is related to, we think it's actually very much a surface phenomenon, that the sunlight really only penetrates microns deep into the plastic, so that very small particles may be shed initially, and then sort of weaknesses in the material cause it to break. So I think there are multiple mechanisms that might be happening simultaneously or similarly on a small piece of plastic versus a very large piece of plastic. But this really is an open question. We don't fully understand how the detergent bottle turns into a million different pieces. It's certainly not a binary fission, but we don't know how much it cracks in half versus sheds off tiny, tiny particles.
Mm-hmm. Thanks. Here's a teaching question. I like those. And I'll read out the whole question because it's a little long, but Dr. Law, how would you begin to bridge the knowledge gap for the general public between the concepts of plastic products and microplastics pollution? People really don't understand that the carbon-carbon backbone plastics break down in the environment, that they photodegrade and become unstable rather than biodegrade. How would you begin to explain this to people who aren't educated in science?
That's a great question. And I guess I mean, if I had an audience in front of me, I would ask if I succeeded in this talk, because I know many people in this talk probably don't have scientific backgrounds. And I almost left out carbon-carbon backbone because that's really not necessary to explain this process, but it's interesting to chemists. With my own children, I think, I explain to them that when an item ends up in the environment, we've all picked up like a plastic cup that's been sitting out too long and it sort of shatters in our hands. But that, just because it gets smaller doesn't mean it ever goes away. And I guess the hard part there is, like, if I think about my compost bin, just because I can't see the pineapple core in there anymore doesn't mean there's no pineapple in my bin. So I think it is a little bit of it's a very big challenge, in fact, and especially because our language can be a little bit blurry. Sometimes we just talk about degradation, and your average person may imagine that degradation means it completely goes away and there's no issue, which by that, that's very different from breaking down into small pieces. So I think it is a challenge, and it gets even more complex if we dip our toe into compostable plastics or so-called biodegradable plastics, and there's a huge greenwashing problem and communications problem. So it's not necessarily simple once you get into the details.
Yeah, there are actually quite a few questions here about compostable plastics, biological-based plastics, and companies that are trying to create a more biodegradable plastic. I would ask you, actually lumping them together, to comment on the success, the future promise of biodegradable plastics, of manufacturing different kinds of polymers.
Oh, that's such a huge question. We could talk for another hour. I'm going to try to take a short stab at it. So one of the main issues, I think, with our plastics today, these carbon-carbon backbone plastics, is that they were designed for use and durability without any thought of what we do with them at the end of their life. And so our options right now are to bury them or to burn them, and for a very small fraction to clean them, remelt them, and turn them into another product. The way forward is going to be to make materials that have a defined end of life. And a compostable plastic could be that. Compostable plastics do biodegrade in very specific environmental conditions that are met in industrial composting facilities or anaerobic digestion digestion facilities. If I throw that compostable plastic into my backyard compost, it is unlikely to fully biodegrade. So we really shouldn't be aiming for making a material that we can throw anywhere we want in the environment and thinking that it's going to go away, because these materials will only degrade under very specific environmental conditions. So if we think about compostable plastics, this is only going to work if we have collection for compostable material and those commercial services that have the facilities that can break that material down. So if you think about a situation where you're using them in association with food delivery, food packaging, and people know that they're compostable and they put them in the right place that gets sent to the right facility, I think that there is a place for this. The challenge is that, it costs more to make a compostable fork. And if the person thought it was recyclable and put it in the recycling bin, now it's contaminated the recycling. And if they don't have compost collection and put it in the trash, well, now you've just made a more expensive plastic fork that's going to go in the landfill or get burned. So it's a complex setting. And the other point I want to make is just to clarify that just because something is bio-based, so most of our plastics are made from petroleum sources or natural gas from fossil fuels. You can make the same plastics from bio-based materials, renewable materials, corn and sugarcane and things like that. It doesn't make them necessarily any more biodegradable. So really the feedstock of the plastic and what happens to it at end of life are two totally different properties, even though they may have bio in the name. So you have to be really, really careful when you're talking about bioplastics, biodegradability, compostability.
We have literally the billion-dollar question sitting in the queue right here about the head-to-head between science and industry. Is the scientific basis for stopping plastics pollution strong enough to counter the immense profitability of plastics? The talk brilliantly reviews the environmental science. Plastics stand rightly condemned, except for the fact that the fossil fuel and petrochemical industries continue to invest in plastics as a basis for their future profits. Can science stop profit in contemporary America?
Oh my gosh. Well, give me the playbook if you know how. This is a huge question. The intervention framework I put up towards the end there had reducing production as the first step, right? And there is increasing pressure, I think, to at least, we cannot keep accelerating plastics production like we have since 1950. We just can't. So there has to be more pressure. I don't know if industry, I don't know how it's going to play out, but this is where I think government regulation has to play a role. There were just some negotiations internationally. We are now in the process of negotiating an international treaty. So putting pressure on people who are negotiating that treaty to put pressure on producers, is one role that we can all take. I don't know the answer. I mean, we're facing climate change, which is as big or bigger of a problem, right? Probably a bigger problem, and it's the same fight. So I don't know. But we have to fight. We have to try to do something.
I will say to the questioner, my own background is I have a doctorate in the history of medicine and public health, and there are some success stories here. And some of them are like lead. When's the last time you were able to buy lead paint or put leaded gasoline in your car? There are ways and places to regulate industry without destroying industry. So we all work together and try to come to new solutions. Gosh, the questions, they keep piling up. Let's see. Why does most plastic end up in the Pacific garbage patch? From an 8-year-old in the audience.
Oh, thank you. I'm not sure that it does. So I think of the ocean in the middle of the Pacific or the middle of the Atlantic as the end of the pipe, because if you've seen Finding Nemo, all of the drains lead to the ocean, right? So if you accidentally lost your candy wrapper and the wind blew it, it might end up in a stream, and the stream might end up in a river, and the river might end up emptying into the Pacific Ocean. And once that candy wrapper is floating in the Pacific Ocean, it's probably going to be breaking down into smaller pieces, but the ocean currents are going to eventually lead it to the middle of the gyre, where it's very hard for it to escape. But it's actually not clear to me whether there are more candy wrappers sitting in our forests and on our streets and parking lots and overflowing garbage cans than there are in the ocean. And that's a really big question. I think we don't fully understand the pathway that our lost plastic trash takes. But we certainly know that if the candy wrapper left my hand, in my backyard, the best thing I can do is pick it up and throw it away.
Question here, what animals and organisms would you say are the most affected by plastics?
That's a really big question. I think we have to break that down. It's the evidence of entanglement of large marine animals, but also birds and smaller animals by lost fishing gear or entangling items like balloon strings or six-pack rings or those plastic packing straps that go around cardboard boxes. That evidence is clear that animals themselves are harmed. Many of these animals are on the endangered species list. The Hawaiian monk seal is a great example of that. The problem is, probably many more animals are interacting with microplastics, whether they're eating them or bringing them in through their gills, or if they're even plants have microplastics stuck to them. We just don't really understand those impacts yet. So that's a really hard question to answer.
Would it help if landfills had updated practices and rules to keep plastics out of the general environment?
So that's an interesting question. I would love for my colleague Jenna Jamek to answer that. Her background is in solid waste management. So my understanding is that in the United States, we have excellent landfills. We line them, like there are many different engineering standards that have to be met. Now, plastic can leak out of the entire system. If in my town, we actually take our waste to the transfer station, to the recycling center. And I see lots of times pickup trucks and the plastic bag flies out. And sometimes you'll put it into the big dumpster and it flies out of there. And certainly if you're, once the dump truck goes to the landfill, things can be flying out. But the attempt really, in fact, there are regulations that have to minimize that leakage from the landfill itself. I think there's still open questions about the leachate that can come out of the bottom of the landfill and what kinds of chemicals or plastics or chemicals associated with plastics might be in that leachate. But for the most part in the US, I actually think that the landfill infrastructure is not really the main problem. And some would argue that's the best place to put the plastic. It's a form of carbon sequestration. We've used the oil and gas to make the plastics, and rather than burn them or risk them being lost to the environment, if we can't recycle them, then perhaps we should just bury them where they'll sit forever.
Here's a question from a microplastics researcher, and we'll just ask one or two more questions since we're past 8 o'clock. What can you say about plastics in the deep sea? People are often concerned about plastics on the surface, but what happens when we look at the ocean bottom?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the reason we talk about the sea surface so much is because it's much easier to measure. In fact, our whole data set was just people, students and scientists towing a net to measure other things and just happened to find plastics. There's a growing body of evidence that microplastics, and we know large plastic debris also, is found on the seafloor, including the deepest parts of the ocean. We know that these microplastics, especially fibers, can be mixed down into the sediments. And there is marine life living at the bottom of the sea and living in the sediments, and people are studying whether or not those organisms may be impacted by the plastics. This is still an open question, I think, in the ocean plastics community. Where is the largest mass of plastics found? Is there more floating? Is there more at the bottom? When you start looking at those tiny microfibers, you really see them well distributed throughout the ocean, whereas the size particles we get in our plankton nets are either going to float or they're going to sink, more or less. They can actually be colonized by microorganisms and start out floating and end up sinking. There are a lot of processes that can happen at the sea surface where there's sunlight and where most of ocean life is occurring, that can change that distribution. But certainly we don't want to neglect the seafloor, and I didn't mean to by not mentioning it very much. We definitely see debris there.
Mm-hmm. So I've seen a number of questions about endocrine and hormone disruption. And I know this isn't specifically your area of expertise, but I do know also that you're pretty familiar with the literature. So the most basic of them are any thoughts about the issue of hormonal disruption that we keep hearing about? Is this a rumor?
Yeah, so this is definitely not my field of expertise, but I think I do try really hard to talk to lots of different communities of researchers. So I, in fact, probably talk to fewer oceanographers than I do people in other fields. And that's including people now studying toxicology and people studying human health. And I think there is a good body of literature. The reason we even know the term endocrine disruptor is because we know there are these chemicals that have impacts on humans. And I think one of the main concerns when we look at the human health studies of the plastics in our blood and our lungs and our poop or whatever, well, maybe not the poop, but is that the chemicals associated with the plastics, the phthalates, the plasticizers, or some of these other chemicals that we know have harmful effects on organisms, that those may be the actual highest risk associated with eating, accidentally eating little bits of plastic. I would say that is one of the biggest concerns. The other is that once the plastics get to those nanoscales, that they could potentially transfer from the blood to the brain, for example, and then start to cause real problems. So the good news is that the toxicology community, the nanoparticle communities, these communities are now like raring to go on plastics and human health. So I really do think we're going to be hearing a lot more, not just about the plastics, but about the chemical additives, including those endocrine disruptors.
Yeah, I was with you on the day that the news came out that microplastics had been detected in human blood. And I know our initial thoughts were, okay, how about the blood-brain barrier? I haven't actually read any further articles about that. Has anything come out that you're aware of about further study on that issue?
No, I haven't seen it. I think where the human health research stands is, and this is credit to this thought goes to Chelsea Rockman, who mentioned it, I think, or maybe it was Jenna. Anyway, one of my colleagues said, human health is where ocean plastics was 15 years ago. We're in the phase where we're looking for plastics. Are they in the poop? Are they in the gut? Are they in the placenta? Are they in the blood? I'm guessing we're going to see something about the brain. It's the next phase that's really hard, which is what happens when it's there. Because again, remember, these microplastics are almost an infinite combination of different types of plastic plus different types of additives. They're different shapes, different sizes. We know particle shape matters from asbestos studies. So I think we're really just at the forefront of where the research is going. But I will say that for decades, I have not microwaved food in plastic, right? There's some sort of basic things just in case. Let's not, put the baby formula in a plastic bottle, or let's not heat anything in a Tupperware. So I think we are all sort of well served by being precautionary.
Yes. Here's the last question, and we're going to stay in the world of human health for the last question. Is much understood about biomagnification in the food web with microplastics? How about in humans?
That's a great question with respect to plastics. I think you've stumped me. I'm not sure that I've actually heard any discussion of that. And because I'm not a biologist, I just suck the brains of other people who are biologists. It's going to take me too long to think through that pathway to understand. I mean, sure, if we're eating seafood that have plastics in them, we're taking them up. I guess the real question is whether or not those plastics are actually being retained in our tissues, right? So that first study with the poop, like we eat them and they come out in our poop, but some of them may actually transfer to tissue and that will then potentially accumulate. But I think we just don't know yet. We don't know.
So we've moved into an evening of Ask Kara Anything, but your status as a synthesizer of the science is phenomenal. There are a lot of questions in the chat about how to take action, and those are actually a little bit more Ask Beyond Plastics, Ask Judith Enck, and Ask Megan Wolfe anything on those. Those of you who are interested in taking action, I would encourage you to check out beyondplastics.org. Our website is full of ways that you can plug in, whether you're a scientist or not. We're very interested in mobilizing the grassroots and helping everybody to feel more efficacious and to be more effective in this realm. It really is, it's a fight that we can't lose in a way because it's such a ludicrous fight, but also in a way because the stakes are so high that we can't lose this. So I'm going to thank you all. I see that Laura Walker has also turned back on her camera. Did you have any parting thoughts, Laura?
No, I just wanted to thank Dr. Law, and you as well, and all the people who have been participating. It's really an honor to have you here.
I echo
Thank
that
you.
sentiment.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for all the great questions. I do hope I can have a chance to read through the chat afterwards. Thank you all for attending.
Take care.